At a prestigious financial institution in downtown Chicago, Marcus Bennett, a well-dressed black man, walked into the bank he himself had built from the ground up. Though today he wasn't entering as the CEO or a man of influence, he was simply there for a routine withdrawal of $15,000 from his personal account. Dressed casually in khakis and a button-down shirt, Marcus blended in with the morning crowd. Yet from the moment he approached the teller, something felt different. He had just witnessed a white customer being warmly greeted and handed $20,000 in cash without so much as a raised eyebrow, but when it was his turn, the atmosphere chilled. The teller, Amy Carter, greeted him with a cold, dismissive tone, offering no eye contact or pleasantries. Instead of processing his transaction as requested, she slid him a clipboard and instructed him to fill this out, as if he were some suspicious outsider rather than a valued customer. Marcus complied without complaint, providing his ID and completing the form, but when Amy saw the amount he wished to withdraw, she pushed the form back toward him and said flatly, "We can't process this." Confused and increasingly frustrated, Marcus pointed out the blatant double standard, referencing the previous customer who had just walked out with more cash. Amy's response? "That's different," only fueled the underlying tension, revealing a deeper issue that had nothing to do with banking policy and everything to do with unspoken bias. Her body language grew defensive, and when she glanced toward the glass-walled office where branch manager Victoria Sanders stood watching, it became clear that Marcus' treatment wasn't a misunderstanding, it was being silently endorsed from above. Victoria's silent nod gave Amy the confidence to stand firmer in her refusal, hiding behind vague protocols that hadn't been applied moments earlier to the white customer. Despite Marcus remaining calm and respectful, the scrutiny intensified. He was now being treated not as a client, but as a potential threat. This wasn't just about a withdrawal, it was a moment that revealed the bank's deeper, systemic issue. Black customers were being held to a different standard. Even in a building he created under his leadership, Marcus was being profiled and humiliated. What they didn't realize, however, was that the man they were trying to eject wasn't just another customer, he was the very person who had made their careers possible, and the consequences of their actions were just beginning to unfold. As Marcus stood calmly at the counter, he could feel the weight of silent judgment pressing down on him. Despite having complied with every instruction and provided valid identification, he was met with mounting resistance from Amy Carter, the teller, and her superior, Victoria Sanders. Their reasoning was cloaked in language about security protocols and unusual activity, but to Marcus the subtext was painfully clear. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about procedure. It was about perception. Specifically their perception of him as a black man attempting to access what they deemed too much cash. Even when he pointed out that a white customer had just walked out with a larger amount unbothered and unquestioned, the bank's staff doubled down. Victoria, the manager, joined the interaction not to resolve it fairly, but to reinforce the unfair treatment Marcus was receiving. She never once looked up his account or verified his transaction history. Instead, she made sweeping assumptions, requesting Marcus verify the source of his funds and the amount of his last deposit, demands she clearly had not made of the previous customer. Marcus, still holding his composure, challenged them directly. What made his withdrawal suspicious, and why had the white man before him not been subjected to the same scrutiny? The answer, though unspoken, echoed in the tension that filled the room. It was about race. Victoria's professional veneer couldn't mask her implicit bias, and Amy's defensiveness made it clear she knew the situation was teetering on the edge of becoming a scandal. When Marcus refused to be dismissed or gaslighted, Victoria took it a step further, silently signaling for security. Ethan Reynolds, a white security guard, approached Marcus with a practiced authority, ready to remove him from the premises. The implication was clear: comply or be escorted out. As Marcus tried to reason with them one final time, recording the interaction on his phone for his own protection, Ethan forcibly grabbed him. The scene escalated quickly. He was dragged out of his own bank like a criminal. His ID, which they refused to even glance at inside, was thrown to the pavement. Customers watched silently, some uncomfortable, none intervening. The only exception was Jamal Brooks, a black security guard who quietly picked up Marcus's ID, dusted it off, and returned it to him with a solemn truth: "They don't want us here." Jamal's words spoke to a lifetime of being sidelined despite doing everything right, earning degrees, staying professional, following every rule, only to still be treated like an outsider. Marcus's quiet fury was now sharpened by clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a one-time incident. It was a reflection of a system that allowed racial bias to thrive behind smiles and protocol. He picked up his phone and made a single call. To David Carter, his trusted ally and a high-ranking executive. The decision to call wasn't about seeking sympathy, it was about accountability. The branch had just expelled its own CEO based solely on skin color, and it was time for that truth to come to light. What Victoria, Amy, and Ethan didn't know was that their actions would soon have consequences far beyond embarrassment. They hadn't just insulted a customer, they had profiled, dismissed, and physically removed the man who built the very foundation they were standing on. And in doing so, they exposed not just their own prejudice, but the rot within a system that allowed it to flourish unchecked. As Marcus stood outside the bank he had once envisioned as a symbol of equity and trust, the sting of humiliation lingered like a bruise beneath his skin. Just moments ago he had been dragged out in full view of onlookers, treated not as the CEO of a prestigious financial institution, but as a threat. Unwelcome and expendable. The slap of cold air on his face wasn't nearly as chilling as the realization that not even in his own bank, built by his own hands, was he free from the burden of suspicion that so often follows black men in spaces of power. But amid that injustice, a quiet moment of truth emerged. Jamal Brooks, a black security guard with tired eyes and the calm gravity of someone who had endured far too much for far too long, stepped forward. Without words of pity or performative outrage, Jamal bent down, retrieved Marcus's discarded ID from the pavement, and handed it back with silent respect. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a weariness that rang deeper than the moment. "This place always does this. Doesn't matter what degrees you've got, how quiet you stay, or how right you play the game. They don't want us here, not really." In that brief exchange, Jamal gave Marcus more than his ID. He gave him a reminder that this wasn't about one incident, but a lifetime of being underestimated, overlooked, and unfairly judged. It was a quiet solidarity, an unspoken bond forged not in friendship but in shared struggle. Marcus didn't need to explain himself. Jamal had already lived that explanation, day after day. The outrage Marcus felt hardened into clarity. Change wasn't just necessary, it was overdue. He wasn't going to yell or plead, he was going to act. With one call, he summoned accountability, and when the dust settled, those who had stood by silently would be forced to witness what happens when power speaks, and when it finally refuses to be ignored. Inside the bank, the air was thick with a false sense of normalcy. Transactions resumed, employees moved about, and no one dared acknowledge what had just happened. That is, until a sleek black car pulled up to the curb and David Carter stepped out. A commanding presence in a sharp suit, David didn't need to raise his voice or flash credentials to make it clear he was someone who mattered. As he walked through the doors, the energy in the room shifted. Even Ethan, the security guard who had forcibly removed Marcus, straightened up, uncertainty creeping into his posture. David didn't pause at the entrance. He moved with purpose, his eyes locking onto Marcus with recognition and restrained fury. He didn't acknowledge Victoria, Amy, or anyone else. He walked past them, silent and surgical, and only stopped once Marcus was at his side. That alone was enough to spark confusion, and then panic. Victoria tried to regain control, her voice brittle under the weight of realization. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I wasn't expecting—" But David cut her off coldly. "Clearly," he said, his tone sharp and unwavering, "because if you had been, this wouldn't be happening." Then came the twist that shattered every assumption in the room. Why was my CEO just thrown out of his own bank? Silence fell like a hammer. Amy paled. Ethan stiffened. Even the tellers who had been feigning ignorance moments earlier froze in place. Victoria stammered, scrambling for excuses about protocols and misunderstandings, but David wasn't having it. He grilled them one by one, demanding simple yes or no answers. Had they verified Marcus's account? Had they applied the same procedures to the previous white customer? Every answer or lack thereof only confirmed what Marcus already knew. This wasn't a misstep, it was blatant profiling. David didn't raise his voice, but his authority rang loud. Victoria was fired on the spot. Amy and Ethan were ordered to undergo mandatory bias training and warned of legal consequences should another incident arise. And in a final act of recognition, Jamal, the quiet security guard who had stood by Marcus, was promoted. The very power structure that tried to reject Marcus now stood exposed, its biases laid bare, and as Marcus stepped back up to the counter, not to argue, but to rightfully claim what was his, no one dared stop him. The lesson had been delivered, loud, clear, and irreversible. With the truth now laid bare and the power dynamic flipped on its head, the final moments inside the bank carried a heavy silence. Gone were the condescending smiles and the smug authority. Victoria, once confident and composed, now stood pale and speechless, her career unraveling with every second. Amy, whose dismissiveness had sparked the chain of events, could no longer meet Marcus's gaze. Ethan, the security guard who had manhandled the CEO moments earlier, stood by the door, visibly shaken, finally understanding the gravity of what he had done. David Carter's words had landed like thunder. "You're done here." And it wasn't just about firing a manager. It was a message to the entire institution. Bias, once hidden beneath procedure, had been brought into the light, and now it was time for accountability. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough. When he stepped back to the counter, Amy quickly moved aside, her hands trembling as she processed the transaction she had so confidently refused earlier. The $15,000 was counted out with care and urgency. No more excuses, no more questions. It was his money, it always had been. But now, the gesture was about more than just cash. It was about restoring dignity. As Marcus accepted the bills, he didn't look at Amy, Victoria, or Ethan. Instead, his eyes found Jamal, the quiet security guard who had shown him something the others hadn't: humanity. Without hesitation, Marcus slid one of the stacks toward him. Jamal blinked, caught off guard. "Sir?" he asked. Marcus met his gaze, voice calm but firm. "Take the day off. It wasn't about charity. It was about recognition." Jamal had stood up in the smallest but most meaningful way, by acknowledging the injustice when no one else did. Before leaving, Marcus turned back to face the people who had tried to deny his worth. His voice was clear, unwavering. "You should have checked my ID." And with that he walked out, not with anger, not with revenge, but with power reclaimed. Outside, the morning air felt different. He hadn't just corrected a wrong, he had exposed a truth many preferred to ignore. And as the doors closed behind him, the message lingered. Justice isn't just about who's right, it's about who refuses to stay silent when they know something is wrong. This story reminds us that dignity, fairness, and respect should never be conditional, not based on skin color, social status, or outward appearance. Even in positions of power, people of color still face silent prejudice, often masked as policy or procedure. But what this moment teaches us is the power of truth, integrity, and quiet strength. Marcus didn't shout, didn't fight. He stood his ground with grace and let the truth reveal itself. And in doing so, he not only reclaimed his place, but reminded others of their shared responsibility. Doing the right thing isn't always loud. It's often a quiet choice made in uncomfortable moments. For older generations, this story serves as both a reflection and a call. To recognize when injustice happens, to speak up, and to support those who are too often overlooked. Whether in a position of influence or in a moment of silence like Jamal's, every action matters. True change doesn't always begin with protest. It often begins with awareness, empathy, and the courage to act with decency. We are never too old to learn and never too wise to remember. Respect should be given freely, not earned through proof.